Hi, this is Jay Callahan again. Another one of our video mini lectures for crisis intervention, social work 645. And today we're going to talk about factors that influence people's reactions to traumatic events. Now, before I do that, I just want to mention, and you can see that I've put on the slide a little warning that, this will be true throughout the course of the semester. Some of the stories that I had to tell you are potentially kind of upsetting. Or very upsetting. Now, I'm not really a believer in so-called trigger warnings about material that might be upsetting in general for people in general. The world's a pretty upsetting place by itself, but I do think there's a place for a warning in case any of you students or any people watching this has actually had a similar experience. So to talk about plane crashes is somewhat upsetting for any of us, but if any of you watching this video has lost a family member or a friend in a plane crash, then that's a different matter. And then I do believe that it's appropriate and right and correct that I let you know that in this video right now I'm going to be talking about a plane crash. I'm also going to be talking about a school shooting. So, school shootings are very upsetting. They're in the news way too often, but I think it's especially important for anybody watching me now to know that if you actually have lost someone or had someone that you care about injured in a school shooting, that you know that is what I'm going to be talking about. Okay? I just want to mention what brought this to my attention one time was a few years ago when I talked in this class about some people who died in a small plane crash, a business jet. And I believe it was 4 people that died, and they died when the plane crashed and caught on fire, and they were badly burned and died. And I talked about that in class, and it turned out that there was a student in the class that had some relatives of hers died in a similar event, in a small plane crash in which they burned to death. And and I did not do any kind of warning at that point, and it really brought home to me when I spoke to her later about how it really would have been helpful to know that in advance before I launched into the story. So today we're going to be talking about a school shooting and a plane crash. Well, our major topic then is factors that influence a person's reaction. And we're going to talk about 2 major categories: factors that relate to the event and factors that relate to the individual in question. So we'll start with factors that relate to the event. What are the issues or variables about the event that have an impact on people who experience them? And one obvious one is the extent of the exposure. If you're held at gunpoint for 10 seconds, versus you're held at gunpoint for 10 hours, obviously the latter is going to be a lot more upsetting. So how much a person is exposed over time, or how close, the intensity of it, this is going to have a major impact on people's reaction to the traumatic event. So I think this is common sense, but the research does back up common sense in this instance, and I want to very briefly, just because it would take too long to give you all the details, but I want to talk briefly about one of the first school shootings that happened in LA in 1984 that really kind of demonstrates this relationship, that the extent of the exposure is important. So here's I have an old newspaper clipping of the story. Happened in 1984. A sniper across the street from a elementary school in Los Angeles started shooting at kids as they were leaving school at the end of a day from a house across the street. And some academics, some researchers in LA were able to interview many of the kids who were involved at this school at the time, and at the time I believe was within like a week or 10 days, and then again a year later, actually 13 months later. Whenever you do this kind of reviews or research, you would want to avoid interviewing people exactly 12 months or 1 year later because of the anniversary reaction. So often 13 months is chosen instead. But if we let me just focus on the interviews that took place most immediately after the event. And as you would expect, the kids that were on the playground that were shot at, one died, a dozen were injured. They were most severely affected in terms of the number of and intensity of the symptoms of traumatic stress they had. Same symptoms, if you recall, that we've already talked about already. And now if we were in class, I would be able to ask you, okay, now that we've come up to the point of traumatic stress symptoms, what are those 5 symptom clusters of traumatic stress? Remember that? So I think I'm not going to name them. I'm hoping that you'll be thinking about them to yourself right now, as I say. So these kids are interviewed as to the presence and the intensity of any of the 5 symptom clusters of traumatic stress. And the kids who were shot at on the playground, of course, not surprisingly, had the most. There were some kids barricaded in the school. Teachers and kids barricaded themselves in the school because they were afraid that the gunman would come into the school next. And they were holed up inside there for quite a while until the police were able to get there and to eventually find the shooter who had by then killed himself. There was a third group of kids who had already left school for the day on their way home, and their level of traumatic stress was much lower. And a fourth group of kids who were on furlough. This was a overcrowded school, and so they met 12 months a year, but only 3/4 at a time. So at any given time, 1/4 of the students were on furlough, and they were also not very affected. And it all makes perfect sense, right? 13 months later, the same thing. The only real difference, well, first of all, the kids that were on the playground still were really struggling, and even 13 months later still had many symptoms of traumatic stress. Some of them enough to be labeled correctly as PTSD. And in the professional article that I read about this, there's a kind of an eerie phrase that they used, which is that the children suffered in silence. And what the authors meant by that is that when they interviewed the kids were quite open about how many symptoms of traumatic stress they had. But on the other hand, when they interviewed the kids' parents and the kids' teachers, they were not fully aware of that. They really overestimated how well the kids were doing, and it seemed like that it was very threatening and upsetting to the adults involved to realize how affected the kids were. The kids who had gone home for the day were doing fine, as you would expect. The kids who were on furlough at the time were doing fine, as you would expect. The only unexpected finding was the kids who were barricaded in the school, who at the time, earlier, right after the event, had high levels of traumatic stress symptoms. Now, 13 months later, they had very low symptoms. And that was because we think that the meaning of the event had changed. And this is something we haven't discussed in great detail yet, but part of the impact of traumatic stress is the meaning of it to the people who experience it. And the meaning of what happened to them in the immediate aftermath was, wow, we thought we were going to be next. I thought I might die. My life was in danger. What's going to happen? And then later it came out that the shooter had stayed in the apartment or room in the house across the street the whole time, and then eventually killed himself. So there was never any attempt to get into the school. Certainly there was never any possibility of a group, an armed band breaking into the school to shoot more students, which was a lot of the ideas that they had had at the time. And so basically the students realized over that year, until they were interviewed later, that they were never in any danger. And once they really realized they were never in any danger, the meaning of the event changed, and they had very low levels of traumatic stress. So I think what we can say here is pretty common sense, straightforward, that increased exposure to the trauma is going to make for more symptoms and more severe symptoms. Here's that picture again. What are some factors related to the event? The cause of the event, and I think I already alluded to this when we talked about the epidemiology of traumatic stress. That is, that events that are caused by human malevolence are the most damaging to people. In the middle are events caused by human error, and the most minor harm is done by acts of nature, weather events, and things like that. And again, I think that is, well, maybe not common sense, but it makes sense when you think about it. The worst thing is when people on purpose do really bad things to each other. Other factors that relate to the event that have an impact on people: the duration of the event, how long does it go on? Is there a warning? And I think that's one reason why hurricanes are not very emotionally traumatic to people. There's plenty of warning. People can leave if they want to, as opposed to tornadoes, which, to be fair, tornadoes, while very damaging, are much less damaging than hurricanes. But the other issue is that with tornadoes, people have 10 minutes of warning as opposed to 3 days of warning. The extent of people's injuries has an impact on their reaction, the extent of physical destruction, and finally the opportunity for action. And heard a few examples that I'll be able to tell you about later if we have time, about, for example, a survivor of a plane crash who did pretty well on his own, but saw a therapist for a while because the woman in the seat next to him died, and he felt helpless to help her, and then felt bad himself. Less trauma and more depression and anxiety, I believe, because that he wasn't able to save her. So opportunity for action is important, and we'll see that in a minute with this other plane crash I want to talk about. And so the other issue here I want to mention is traumatic stimuli, and that is the sights, the sounds, and the smells of a traumatic event can have a dramatic impact on people. So this is about the crash of Northwest Flight 255, which happened in 1987. It happened at Detroit Metropolitan Airport. I lived in Ann Arbor at the time, and 154 people died. One little girl survived, and nobody really knows how that happened. So this was a major plane crash at the time, and had a dramatic impact on everybody in the surroundings. But the issue that I wanted to talk about was the impact on the emergency responders, on the first responders to the scene. So this is a picture. This is actually CGI. This is a graphic representation of what happened, not the actual picture, but I think that's pretty accurate. Here's a picture of a lot of the damage. The plane crashed on an expressway, near the airport. Here's a picture of some of the other damage. So the sights, the sounds, and the smells is our topic right here. And the specifics are that when this plane crashed, a lot of first responders from Detroit. Well, Detroit Metropolitan Airport is kind of halfway between Detroit and Ann Arbor. So not only did police and fire, ambulance, first responders from Detroit and Wayne County responded, but also from Ann Arbor and other communities to the west also went to the airport to try to rescue people, to do whatever they can. And so I knew a few of the police and paramedics who went to the scene, and they told me about it later. And in terms, again, of sights, sounds, and smells, they said it looked like hell. And it looked like hell makes it sound like it's like you have a teenage kid that doesn't clean up the room, and come on, Bobby, clean up your room. It looks like hell. What I'm talking about here, is this scene literally looked like hell, and this like our mythological image of what hell might look like. So maybe this second picture I showed you already maybe has a little bit of what it can capture for you, but you can see all of those yellow blankets are covering dead bodies. So this was a plane. This was a Northwest flight that was leaving Detroit to go to Arizona, I believe, and they took off again from Detroit Metropolitan Airport and never got more than 40 feet off the ground. At which point, as I showed you before, the plane tilted over on one side. One of the wings hit the roof of a rent-a-car building, and then it crashed on the expressway. Later, it came out that the pilots had neglected to extend the flaps. Now, the flaps are those parts of the wings that extend on takeoff to make the wings a greater area, to give greater lift to the airplane. And for whatever reason, they did not extend the flaps, and there was a warning system that was supposed to warn them if they did not extend the flaps, but it had been disconnected. and no one was ever able to find out in the investigation why that warning system was disconnected. Was it the same pilots that disconnected it earlier? That was never able to be ascertained. But it did become clear that it was pilot error, that it wasn't mechanical failure, for example. So although obviously at the time nobody knew that, it takes months before the results of this kind of investigation comes out. The paramedics and the police officers that I know said that it was very traumatic, it was very upsetting, and it looked like hell. And what they meant by that was when the first people got to the scene of the crash, it was kind of twilight, and it was getting dark, and there was no lights really except the police cars and the ambulances and the fire trucks. So we got red and blue lights going around in a flickering way, which makes it kind of bizarre. That there were numerous small fires, so that the basic consequence of a plane like this, even though it only got 40 feet off the ground, it was still flying at several hundred miles an hour, and it was full of jet fuel. So when it crashed, it blew everything into small pieces, including the plane and including the people. And so many of these yellow blankets were actually covering body parts, not necessarily even whole bodies. But even at the time, before, you can see obviously this picture was taken sometime later, that at the time the first responders reported to me that there's just these red and blue lights, and that's eerie enough, that there's numerous small fires, and that early on some of the first responders went around and put the yellow blankets down on the body parts, so some of the blankets caught on fire, and there were numerous small fires, and that the smell was what probably made it the worst of all, because the plane was full of jet fuel, and so when the plane crashed, it spilled jet fuel all over everything, and the jet fuel was burning, the bodies were burning, some pieces of the plane which were flammable were burning. And the worst part of that for some of the first responders was, again, this was in the 1980s, so a number of the police officers and paramedics were Vietnam veterans, and in Vietnam they experienced the trauma of bodies being burned by napalm. Now, napalm was jellied gasoline that was used by U.S. forces to burn off some of the shrubbery and the trees that the enemy soldiers would hide under. But in fact, it turns out that the soldiers used napalm on the enemy soldiers as well, and so that is the smell of burning bodies. I've actually talked to paramedics more recently, and they call it the smell of death. It's that and I've never smelled it myself, but the smell of burning bodies is a very characteristic smell that is haunting for people, and that's what they experienced here. And not only is it a haunting smell for anybody, but for the Vietnam veterans who had smelled bodies burned by napalm, it turns out that bodies burned by jet fuel is very similar. And so some of them had, I don't think they had full-fledged flashbacks, but some of them had intrusive memories of Vietnam, just to make things worse, because the smell was so provocative and so powerful for them. So many of these police officers and paramedics were like, tough guys. They had been in combat, they had been in other traumatic situations, but many of them reported that the scene of the crash of this flight was like very upsetting to them, and I can't be too surprised, right? I think for any of us it would be profoundly upsetting and profoundly disturbing to be at a scene like this. Okay, so the sights, the smells, and the sounds. And then finally I want to talk briefly about factors related to the person. Those are all factors related to the event. I think that some of the issues about the sights, smells, and sounds will come up again later in some other stories I have. But let's talk about factors related to the person now. Very briefly, that probably the most important one is prior trauma. So some people used to hypothesize, which I've listed here on the second bullet point, the fallacy of inoculation hypothesis, that people thought that if you went through minor traumatic events early, you would be inoculated and better able to handle other traumatic events in the future or when they happen to you. But that turns out not to be true. And in a major study of Vietnam veterans, it became very clear that prior trauma made a person more vulnerable to trauma in the future when it happened again. This is a study of Vietnam veterans that found that of the veterans who had PTSD from combat, those who had been physically or sexually abused as children, which was information that had been gathered when they first joined the military, that the ones who had PTSD from combat but who had also been physically or sexually abused as children had worse PTSD, were more likely to have PTSD from combat, all things being statistically controlled, and were more likely to have more severe forms of PTSD. So prior trauma makes people more vulnerable to subsequent trauma in their life. So the inoculation hypothesis is not true. Now, maybe in some kind of minor cases, because I know paramedics do say that they think newly trained paramedics do well if they have minor traumatic events, car accidents and things like that, that they have to cope with before they ever face a major one. And that if they face a major one too soon in their career, they tend to quit. So there might be something to it, the inoculation hypothesis, when we talk about smaller traumatic events. But the basic research finding, which has been duplicated now a number of times, is prior trauma makes a person more vulnerable to subsequent trauma. What are other factors related to the person? Prior mental health problems, prior family dysfunction, prior childhood, the ACEs idea, childhood adverse childhood experiences, all make a person more vulnerable to trauma. That resilience or hardiness, which is thought to be partly a genetic characteristic and then partly related to personality factors, makes a person more able to stand up to trauma, to not be severely affected by trauma. And finally, a person's self-expectations. If a person just has the self-efficacy, the idea that they can probably handle a given situation, then they probably do pretty well. If they have the self-perception that they would not be able to handle it, then they tend not to be able to handle it very well. All right, so we've talked here in this video mini lecture about factors that relate to the event that have an impact on how people are affected by it, and then factors related to the individual person. All right, so I'll see you next time.